Hi, everyone. My name is Wade Costley, and I'm the Website Information Officer for My CP Guide and the Board Director at Cerebral Palsy Australia. Welcome to today's webinar, during which we'll talk about ableism and how adults with cerebral palsy confront and cope with it. First, I'm going to start our session today with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands which you all reside today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures. A few things to note quickly before I introduce our presenters today. First, today's session is being recorded to publish later on the MyCP Guide website. Attendee names will not be visible in the video recording once it has been uploaded to MyCP Guide. So, for anyone who may have concerns about identifiable information, please be assured that you can take part later in the Q&A segment, and you will be anonymous in the published recording. For this Q&A segment, following the presentation, we encourage you to submit any questions or comments you have for the group at any time during the presentation by clicking the Q&A button and submitting your question there. Please note that attendees' microphones are muted by default during the presentation. So if you have an accessibility need or preference to ask a verbal question instead, please click the raise button with the hand icon so that we can unmute you during the actual Q&A segment. And last, if you wish to use closed captions during this session, go to the top menu and click More, then Language and Speech, then turn on live captions. That's More, then Language and Speech, then turn on live captions. These are automatically generated captions provided by Microsoft Teams, so they may not be word perfect, but they're pretty close. Today's webinar is actually a collaboration between my CP Guide and the Cerebral Palsy Support Network, or CPSN. CPSN is a specialist disability service provider for people with cerebral palsy and similar disabilities. They provide individual support, independent living services, and support coordination alongside trusted information and guidance to help people navigate the NDIS, build independence, and live well at every stage of life. You can find out more about CPSN and the services that they provide at cpsn.org.au. And now, finally, for today's webinar titled You're So Inspiring, How Adults with CP Confront and Cope with Everyday Ableism. Examples of ableism can be when adults with cerebral palsy are often given help they didn't ask for, or labeled inspirational for doing ordinary tasks, or mocked for how they move or speak, or treated like children, or simply overlooked. These experiences are all examples of everyday ableism. Cadeyrn Gaskin and a team of researchers that we have here tonight, including Goodridge, Finn O'Keefe, and Alex Birnie, recently published a study on how adults with cerebral palsy successfully confronted ableism during encounters with others and successfully coped with it. And tonight, we're going to hear more about this study. So, Cadeyrn, over to you.
Thank you so much, Wade. And good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on ableism. To give you some background, I am a social scientist, a non-disease director, and a person with cerebral palsy. I led this research, which was done through Deakin University in conjunction with Cerebral Palsy Support Network. Adam, Finn, Alex, and I are part of a team of researchers made up of people with cerebral palsy and our able-bodied allies. We came together with the purpose of researching a topic of importance to the lives of adults with cerebral palsy. We ended up deciding to research ableism and, more specifically, ableism that occurs during interactions with others. We wanted to know how adults with cerebral palsy had successfully confronted ableism after it occurred. We also wanted to know how they successfully coped with ableism in general in the hours, days, months, and years after these encounters. We let our participants decide what counted as success. Here's an outline of what we will cover this evening. We learned early on in the project that ableism is an idea that is not well understood. People seem to have better handle on other forms of prejudice and discrimination, such as sexism and racism. So, this evening, Adam is going to help us get on the same page by providing us with a good understanding of what ableism is and the way it manifests during encounters with others. Most of the examples of ableism he uses come from our research. Next, Finn will take you through our findings on confronting ableism. In particular, he will talk about what people with cerebral palsy did to confront ableism and what were the successful outcomes. After that, Alex will present our findings on how adults with cerebral palsy have coped with ableism. And finally, there will be a Q&A session. This webinar includes material on prejudice and discrimination against people with cerebral palsy, as well as sexual references. Some people may find the content distressing. If this is you, please reach out for support if you need it. Your GP is a good place to start. Also, we've placed the contact details of other services on the screen. We did this research in the hope that it will help people with cerebral palsy to confront and cope with ableism in their own lives. We hope our work will be of help to you. So let's get started. I'm going to hand over to Adam to present on understanding ableism.
I am a software engineer by trade. Throughout my life, I've encountered ableism in many forms, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, and often even from people who genuinely mean well. These experiences have shaped how I move through the world and how I understand the barriers disabled people face every day. First up, you may notice my mouth aren't moving. No, I'm not a ventriloquist, but I will be giving my part of the presentation using my trusty alternative communication device. My job this evening it is to ensure that we are all on the same page when it comes to understanding ableism. When we started this project, we discovered that there were varying levels of understanding of ableism within our team, so, for some of us, this was quite a learning curve. When we talk about ableism, we are talking about unfavorable attitudes and behaviors towards people with disability. These attitudes and behaviors are grounded in the belief that people without disability are better or more capable than people with disability. Now, ableism can appear in many different ways. Buildings and infrastructure can be designed in ways that make it difficult for people with disability to use. Schools may encourage students with disability to go elsewhere. Health and justice systems can see disability as something to be criminalized or medicalized. As far as interactions between people go, ableism can manifest as harassment and bullying, violence or threats of violence, dehumanization, neglect, and so forth, just because people are disabled. And then there are more subtle forms of ableism that occur in everyday interactions with others. These forms of ableism are called microaggressions. Microaggressions are brief, often automatic, seemingly harmless, everyday exchanges that diminish people due to their disability. They are harmful, particularly when carried out by family and friends. And they are what we focused on in our work. What I intend to do in the remainder of my section of this webinar is to give you many examples of ableist microaggressions, because I think it's a good way to get a handle of this topic. I'm going to use examples from our research and our experiences. I'm focusing on 10 common ableist microaggressions that people with cerebral palsy experience in their everyday lives. They are listed on this slide. Let's start with infantilization because I think it is one of the ones that is most easily recognizable. Someone's manner of speaking changes when talking to a person with cerebral palsy. They raise the pitch of their voice or become overly sing-song, in ways usually reserved for toddlers. They use pet names, like sweetie and buddy, or good girl or good boy. They may revert to childlike phrasing, such as, "Did we make our own breakfast today?" You get the picture. This way of speaking may be okay if the person with cerebral palsy is a child, but if they're an adult, well, that's a different story. I recently had my own experience of infantilization. In January, I was ordering from a food van. I had typed what I wanted on my phone and the owner of the food van called me a good boy. Like typing on my phone was a big deal for me and it was amazing that I could do it. Even so, they even gave me the food for free. This was a negative experience for me. Let's go to patronization, which seems to commonly occur. Patronization is when someone is condescending or praises a person with cerebral palsy for doing everyday tasks. There were numerous examples in our research. One person with cerebral palsy said that strangers had regarded her to be an inspiration for just achieving age-typical milestones. Another said they had been complimented for coping well with their disability. A third retold the story of how a potential employer had patted her on the arm, rather than shaking her hand, before a job interview. These actions convey the message that people with cerebral palsy are special for living with their conditions. And now for perceived helplessness. Perceived helplessness is when someone frantically tries to help a person with cerebral palsy. This help is unrequested and typically unwanted. In our work, there were several examples. One person described how she was finishing her supermarket shopping when another shopper wanted to help her to enter her PIN when making the payment. This is an example of denial of privacy, which we will discuss next. Another gave an example from her childhood. A teacher wanted the person with cerebral palsy to use a substitute runner during a game. The message behind these actions is that the people can't do things for themselves because they have cerebral palsy. Now we'll go on to denial of privacy. Denial of privacy is when someone demands personal information from a person with disability or unnecessarily touches their body or equipment. Participants in our research mentioned being asked about their limp or their injury or being asked that question, "What's wrong with you?" One person described a situation where they had just facilitated a training session and someone asked them how they toilet. The key message here is that people with cerebral palsy are not allowed to keep information about their disability private. Let's do spread effect. It's another common one. Spread effect occurs when someone makes assumptions that functional limitations in one area translates to limitations in other, perhaps all, areas. One man with cerebral palsy told us he had been shouted at under the assumption that he was deaf. Another relayed the story that nurses were apprehensive about how she would be able to care for her newborn. A third person said that a potential employer had been concerned about how she would travel to and from work should she be given the job. The underlying message is that your cerebral palsy invalidates you in all areas of life. We'll move on to denial of personal identity. Denial of personal identity occurs when someone focuses on a person's disability and ignores other important aspects of who they are. We came across denial of disability in or work. One woman described how students, when she was at school, referred to her as a spastic. Another woman told us about how she would be with her support worker when she picked her kid up from school, and how the other mothers at the school gate assumed that the support worker was the child's mother, not the woman with cerebral palsy. Here, the message is that the only thing we see when we look at a person with cerebral palsy is their disability, and that there are no parts of the lives of people with cerebral palsy that are the same as those without disability. Then there is denial of disability. This is when someone denies or minimizes disability-related experiences. They are effectively saying that your thoughts and feelings about your experiences probably aren't real and, even if they are, they're not important. We had several examples in our research. A stranger challenged a person with cerebral palsy about using an accessible parking space and prevented her from leaving. To the stranger, she wasn't disabled enough. Another person with cerebral palsy described how her adult children did not assist with meal preparation, oblivious to the challenges for a person with cerebral palsy of making the family dinner. Next, we need to talk about second-class citizenship. This occurs when a person with cerebral palsy is denied the right to equality because respecting their right is considered bothersome, unjustified, or unreasonable. In our work, one person talked about how restaurant waitstaff had asked her companions what she wanted to order rather than her. Another person described how she had been asked to speak at a conference, but conference organizers had not made plans for the stage to be accessible for wheelchair users. At the heart of these experiences is the message that the right to equality of people with cerebral palsy aren't important. The next one is secondary gain. Secondary gain is when someone has expectations of praise or feeling good for doing something for a person with cerebral palsy. Rather than a genuine desire to assist a person with cerebral palsy, some people are opportunists who act in their own self-interest. They seek to gain from the experience. A man with cerebral palsy in our project described a situation where a stranger followed him from the car park into his workplace and asked to pray for him. At its core, such actions send a message that the dignity and needs of people with cerebral palsy are secondary to the needs of others to receive praise and to feel good and virtuous. Let's finish with desexualization. Desexualization is treating an adult as if they're not a sexual person. We didn't come across any examples in our research. This doesn't mean that our participants didn't experience situations in which they were desexualized, but rather they didn't report instances when they had successfully confronted desexualization. One of our research team mentioned times when others had assumed his partner was his mother, his sister, or his support worker. The message here is that people with cerebral palsy aren't sexual beings, aren't attractive, and aren't worthy of romantic love. In this first part of the webinar, we aim to give you a better appreciation of the various ways in which ableism manifests during interactions with others. We wanted to provide you with heaps of examples because we know that ableism is not well understood. For many, if not all, of us, identifying the numerous, subtle forms of ableism invites us to consider how we interact with people with disability, and how we might do so in less ableist ways. For some watching this webinar, the material may have raised uncomfortable, if not painful, memories of times that you have experienced ableism. Hopefully, this webinar gives you new ways to understand these situations. And the positive news is that we found ways in which people with cerebral palsy have successfully confronted ableism. I will now hand over to Finn to cover what these people did when they experienced ableism and the successful outcomes they achieved.
Thanks so much, Adam. And hi, everyone. My name's Finn. I'm a community worker with cerebral palsy, and outside my day job, I'm also a co-researcher and associate investigator on studies like this one with CPSN and Deakin University, and also with Melbourne University. So in my section of the presentation, I'm going to focus on what people with CP in our research did when they experienced ableism and the successful outcomes that they achieved. So as Adam's already explained, ableism occurs in lots of many everyday forms. And our research looked at all those different types of ableism and the way people with CP actually confronted it. Confronting ableism involves speaking up or taking action when someone is treated unfairly or inappropriately because of their disability. This might include advocating for yourself or seeking help or advocacy from someone else after the event. It can also include responding non-verbally, using humour, or disengaging and just walking away. Confronting ableism is important because it might have the potential to reduce negative attitudes and unfavourable treatment of people with disability. It may also support mental health and well-being. So first of all, I'm just going to talk a bit about what we did. So our aim with the study was to understand and share knowledge about how adults with cerebral palsy challenged prejudice and social oppression they faced by successfully confronting and coping with everyday ableism. To do this, we interviewed or surveyed 10 people with CP about situations where the ableism occurred, the actions people with CP took to confront perpetrators, and the outcomes that followed. Between them, the research participants provided 23 examples of times when they successfully confronted ableism. Now, we know that people have different ideas about what counts as success. So what success actually meant was left up to each person to define for themselves. We also knew from previous research that success sometimes means changing someone's behaviour or simply just feeling satisfied with how they responded in the moment. Before we go over the ways in which our participants confronted ableism, I want to talk to you about some of the general observations about ableism and trying to confront ableism that we heard. So one of our findings was that ableism was very common in the lives of people with CP. Participants described ableism as something that builds up over time through lots of big moments as well as small daily interactions or microaggressions, as Adam just explained. As one participant told us, I wish I could hit the pause button on ableism for a while and have a break because I feel like it's compounding. You have the big moments, but you have all these micro subtle forms that just continue as well. Participants told us that confronting ableism is hard. Many struggled to think of examples where they thought they'd successfully confronted it. And that was for reasons such as they didn't always recognise ableism when it happened. They sometimes ignored it, either consciously or unconsciously, or they weren't sure whether the way they responded was successful. Another participant told us, it's hard to think of successful examples because I'd say the majority aren't successful. So what are the reasons for that? People with CP described a mix of challenges and emotions when they were confronted by ableism, including struggles that they grappled with internally, and that included self-doubt, the pressure to respond perfectly in the moment, the exhaustion of constantly having to explain themselves, and the need to confront their own internalized ableism and acknowledge their own disability. As one person said, you can't confront the ableism you face if you can't confront your disability. People with CP also talked about factors relating to the other person which make it hard to confront ableism. They told us that perpetrators often have good intentions, for example, referring to people with disability as inspirational or courageous. Perpetrators might not realise their behaviour was ableism, and perpetrators also might not have been used to having these behaviours challenged. Perpetrators also frequently held incorrect assumptions about what people with CP, about who we are and what we can do. But the good news is that despite all of this, our participants did tell us that there were many ways that they had successfully confronted ableism. And from what they said, we identified 5 broad strategies they used when confronting ableism. So seen together, these form a toolbox of approaches that people with CP can use to respond to everyday ableist encounters. So the 5 categories, as you can see on the slide: educating perpetrators about CP and correcting misconceptions, being independent, declining help and demonstrating ability, self-advocating, which is confronting perpetrators or seeking help from others, making people uncomfortable, using humour or blunt responses to highlight how inappropriate ableism actually is, or simply disengaging, ignoring, avoiding or refusing to engage with the ableist behaviour, raw strategies. Importantly, success doesn't have to always mean changing the other person's worldview. Sometimes success is simply removing yourself from the situation. So next, I'm going to look at each of these strategies in turn with some of the examples from our research. So education. Participants talked about many situations where they were able to successfully educate perpetrators in the moment and challenge the idea that their abilities were less than others, or that their everyday actions were somehow exceptional just because they had a disability. In one example, a stranger referred to a person with CP as inspirational for achieving typical everyday age-typical milestones. The person explained their achievements were not exceptional, but were the result of equal expectations and access to support. Another person talked about being confronted in a car park, and Adam alluded to this one, and the person questioned her right to use a disabled parking spot and prevented her from leaving. To overcome this, she educated the perpetrator by showing him her permit and then talking about how her CP affected her. The stranger moved aside and the person was able to leave. In another example, a person with CP offered her hand at the start of a job interview, but the potential employer patted her on the arm instead of shaking it. During the interview, the person with CP explained how her CP affected her, and she told us she not only felt good about educating the prospective employer, the interaction taught her how to handle similar situations in the future and helped her to see that people are not inherently bad. They often just need education. The next strategy that we heard about, being independent, which was a very powerful strategy where people with CP talked about declining help and demonstrating their ability. So examples included the shopper who attempted to help a person with CP enter their PIN number. The person informed the shopper they were capable and requested space. And as the person with CP then reflected, the other customers are left with no choice but to back away. Another person said nurses doubted her ability to care for her newborn child. By demonstrating her independent capability, she was able to correct their assumptions. She said, when the nurses watched me change nappies and things, I used my one hand. I used my teeth to kind of hold different things. And it looked a bit messy, but it gets the job done. Over time, nurses realized she was capable. Their first thoughts around me not being able to do things were not correct. I can do the nappies, I just do them in a different way. Self-advocating is another strategy which involves speaking up when ableism occurs or requesting advocacy from others such as teachers, employers or parents to advocate on your behalf after the fact. In one example that Adam talked about, and I'm sure resonates strongly with many of us, school students called a person with CP a spastic. The student with CP told their parents and the students were later asked to apologise and the whole class was educated about cerebral palsy. As I said, I remember the girls were all called into a meeting with our class teacher and they were forced to write notes of apology to me. Another person with CP recounted a time when wait staff addressed her companions at a table rather than her when taking the order, but she was able to redirect attention towards herself using clear and specific language, and she was then treated as an active participant. So these examples show that direct action by people with CP, either in the moment or afterwards, can be both equally effective strategies for confronting ableism and educating or changing the behaviour of perpetrators. Making people uncomfortable. So this next strategy is another really common one. So being asked intrusive personal questions by strangers was something we heard a lot about from people we interviewed. A successful strategy in these situations was to use humour or confronting language to highlight the inappropriate nature of this kind of ableism. For example, a bar patron asked a person with cerebral palsy, "What's wrong with you, love?" The person with CP delivered a humorous, sexualized verbal response, and the patron left them alone pretty quickly. They do this thing where they come and put their hand on your thigh, and they kind of lean in a bit, and then be like, "What's wrong with you, love?" And I said, "I got whiplash from a vibrator, mate." In another example, a stranger asked about a participant's injury. She bluntly replied that it was due to a really bad birth injury and walked away. A third example by a person with CP who was facilitating the training workshop was asked by the participant how they toileted. They just refused to answer the question and instead threw it back at them, "How do you toilet?" And they repeated it several times. The training participant appeared pretty uneasy and walked away. Disengaging with perpetrators of ableism or encouraging others to do the same is another successful strategy. As one person told us, sometimes success looks like just allowing myself to turn and wheel away. In another example, a stranger followed a person with CP into his workplace and asked to pray for him. The person just declined and the stranger walked away. Another participant told us she chose to cut complete contact with her ableist parent. She said, "I was just really over it, particularly around my achievements. He would make comments about it being because of my disability, so I just started to really ignore it and cut it from there." As she explained, afterwards she did not have to see her father, and her father later admitted he was wrong about their ability to graduate university. The person achieved academically and realised she could not change her father's ableism. These examples remind us that as people with CP, we have the right to protect our well-being by choosing to remove ourselves from situations that are harmful. Our research also showed a range of successful outcomes from confronting ableism. So these included bringing about changes in perpetrators' behaviour at the time, changes in perpetrator perceptions about ableism and CP, preventing ableism from happening in the future, disengaging with the perpetrator, or people with CP gaining insights into ableism how it can be managed, or simply just feeling successful about how the interaction occurred and how they managed it. And as I mentioned before, success isn't always defined by changing behaviour. Often it was about maintaining control, dignity, and changing thinking about yourself or feeling okay and about how the person responded. A tentative finding from our research is that different strategies may also be linked to different outcomes. So educating perpetrators and being independent appeared to be linked to changes in behaviour and perception, whereas making people uncomfortable was linked to disengagement and feeling successful. Self-advocating or requesting advocacy and disengaging all had multiple outcomes, including educating perpetrators and feeling successful. So in summing up, everyday ableism occurs in many different ways. It can often go unrecognised by people with CP and it's widely misunderstood. So confronting ableism therefore often feels pretty difficult and the results can feel uncertain. But there is good news because we have seen people with CP can successfully confront ableism in a variety of different ways. Confronting ableism can challenge assumptions of perpetrators and change behaviour in the moment as well as over time. People with CP may also have improved mental health and well-being as a result of confronting or disengaging with perpetrators. Our research shows that confronting ableism may be a form of resilience and self-empowerment, not just a reaction. Success isn't just one single outcome. It can be whatever someone feels to maintain their dignity, sense of control, and peace within themselves. And I'll leave you with this final participant quote. They said, "For me, I suppose I don't think it'll change people's behaviour or attitude. I think that it's in the situation. For me, it's about wanting to maintain control of that situation. If I can stay calm and call it out, then I feel at peace with myself. I think it's about feeling at peace with myself." And now I'll hand over to Alex, who's going to talk about coping with ableism.
Thanks, Finn. I'm Alex, and by way of an introduction, I am a community radio presenter, assistant program manager, and secretary. I'm currently studying a Bachelor of Speech and Language Sciences and Master of Speech Pathology at Victoria University. I have cerebral palsy and am passionate about communication, inclusion, and advocacy. I'm going to be talking about how adults with cerebral palsy in our research coped with ableism, not just in the moment, but in the hours, weeks, months, and even years afterwards. To start with, what is meant by the term coping? Coping simply means how people manage stressful situations. In our study, participants described 4 main ways in which they successfully coped with ableism: changing their own thinking about disability and ableism, participating in everyday activities, looking for social support, and trying to change society. First, I am going to speak about how participants changed their own thinking about disability and ableism. They used ideas like high adaptive defense mechanisms, cognitive reframing, social model of disability, human rights, and disability identity. I will explain what each of these mean and how they were used in our research. From what people said, it seemed like some of them were using high adaptive defense mechanisms. In psychology, high adaptive defense mechanisms are healthy ways in which our minds automatically manage stress, anxiety, and painful emotions without distorting reality. Examples of high adaptive defense mechanisms include using humor, leaning on others for support, and channeling anger into exercise. They enable people to deal with hard situations and stay healthy. In our study, some adults with cerebral palsy blocked ableist encounters from their memories. Some used humour to take the sting out of ableism, and some turned to other people for support. Cognitive reframing, another psychological idea, is when a person changes the way they think about a situation so that it feels less personal and overwhelming. It often involves noticing negative thoughts and replacing them with more helpful and realistic ones. This strategy can be used to cope with ableism because it can help to reduce stress and support emotional well-being. It can also help people feel more in control of their experiences. By changing how a situation is understood, cognitive reframing can help build resilience and help people respond more confidently to difficult or unfair situations in everyday life. Cognitive reframing was used in a number of different ways in our research, such as seeing society as the problem, not themselves, a key concept in the social model of disability; viewing ableism as an opportunity to teach others; seeing confronting ableism as an opportunity to prevent others experiencing it; and responding positively to ableism to protect their self-esteem. Participants spoke about the benefits of learning about the social model of disability, disability rights, different types of ableism, and the ableism experiences of other people with disability. All of these ideas point to the same truth. Disability isn't the problem. It's the unfair attitudes, barriers, and treatment in society. And people with disability keep showing that the issue lies in the environment, not in them. Exposure to the social model of disability can be powerful because it incorporates the idea that it is society that creates barriers and limits a person's opportunities rather than their impairments. Similarly, disability rights are based on people with disability have the same right as anyone to make decisions about their own lives, be included, access what they need, and live free from discrimination and harm. And learning about different types of ableism and hearing about how other disabled people experience and cope with it helps us recognise patterns, name what's happening, and feel less alone, which makes it easier to respond, set boundaries, and push for change. Another important aspect in relation to changing thinking involved identifying as a person with a disability, and more specifically, identifying as a person with cerebral palsy. Doing this can shape how someone understands themselves and their experiences. Instead of seeing disability and cerebral palsy as a limitation, realizing it as a strength to empower themselves and others and advocate for positive change. In our study, there was a powerful quote from one of our participants which highlights changing in thinking. The shift for me in terms of how I felt about myself and how I felt about the ableism that I was encountering as a young person, the shift from feeling like I was wrong and I was flawed and there was something wrong with me, was when I got that political analysis of the social model and disability as a human rights issue and started to think, no, hang on, the problem isn't me. The problem is ableism and structural issues in society that exclude disabled people. And that was really pivotal in changing my feelings about myself and my feelings about the world. So everything I've presented so far focused on how people with cerebral palsy change their thinking about ableism and disability as a way of coping with ableist encounters. And this way of coping with ableism was summed up beautifully in this quote, which shows the change in thinking for this person, from understanding cerebral palsy to be an individual problem to seeing it as a problem with society. I'm going to turn now to the other three ways of coping with ableism, starting with participating in everyday activities. They spoke about living their lives fully and doing things they enjoyed. This didn't mean pretending a CP didn't exist. Participants still asked for support when needed, but they refused to let cerebral palsy define them. A key part of this was showing to themselves and others that there is more to participants than their disability, and that they have a wide range of skills and hobbies. As another participant tells, I've spent the past week or so just training in this video game so that I can get better at it, so that I can kind of feel like, oh, I did this. And it's not necessarily to prove people wrong or anything like that, but just to be kind of like, I'm more than my disability. Now I'll move on to seeking social support. Participants also successfully coped with ableism by looking for social support from others who had similar experiences, including people with cerebral palsy, people with disability, and LGBTQIA+ people. Getting support from others with cerebral palsy helped our participants feel like they were not alone and that their experiences were understood. Through this support, they gained stronger connections with other people with cerebral palsy. Participants also sought support from family and friends. This was done either in person or through social media. Some participants also received support from counsellors who were aware about disability or willing to learn about disability. Participants emphasised the need to be careful when choosing a counsellor, however, because they had found that some counsellors are ableist. One of our participants highlighted the importance of having community support. So having a sense of community around me, and sometimes that's even about like when something happens, being able to write a Facebook status update about it and get some support, like immediately in those moments, or writing a humorous thing about it, and knowing that, you know, I've got that virtual community who get it. So sometimes it's not just about having those physical people in your life. When you're dealing with it, with those kinds of responses or perceptions, also having that virtual community as well has been really important. Finally, the last way in which people successfully coped with ableism was by trying to change society. Trying to change society included educating others about disability, teaching people with cerebral palsy how to confront ableism, and disability advocacy for themselves and others. As one participant said to us, I used to avoid being seen as a person with a disability. Now I have learned to embrace it and believe it is essential to change society, and often that happens by educating one person at a time. The exciting thing about this quote, and indeed all our quotes, is that people with cerebral palsy have found ways of successfully coping with ableism. They have done so through changing their thinking, doing everyday activities, leaning on others for support, and trying to change society. With ableism being a challenging and often harmful constant in the lives of many people with cerebral palsy, the evidence we have produced on confronting and coping with ableism contains a powerful message that, in some instances, such behaviours may be able to be successfully confronted, and there may be ways of successfully coping with the enduring effects of these encounters. And with that, I'll hand you back to Wade to conduct the Q&A.
Thanks, Alex, for that, and thanks to Cadeyrn, Adam, and Finn for such an insightful presentation. And we'll let people have some more time to submit their questions again through the Q&A button on the top of your screen. And while they're doing that, I'll just remind you to check out my CP guide at mycpguide.org.au, where you'll find the latest information and resources covering all aspects of living with CP. Also, links to essential websites related to health and well-being, disability, and support. Also, fact sheets in easy English that address health, independence, and everyday life, and blogs that show the diversity of people with CP and their family. And of course, we have webinars. And also, you can check out CPSN's offerings at cpsn.org.au, where you'll find more information on the extensive support services that they provide, including those for independent living, navigating the NDIS, and nursing services. So I'll start off with the first question. I'm sure that everyone attending this webinar with lived experience of cerebral palsy can relate to ableism on every level that we've presented tonight. And we've each in our own way have learned to, yes, confront it and also cope with it as well. But my question to Cadeyrn and the rest of you is, okay, so we know kind of how to deal with it, but what would be your advice for parents, friends, and allies of people with CP when they're with that person and there's that, ableism right there? What would you recommend that they do?
Thank you for the quick question, Wade. And of course, our research was on how people with cerebral palsy themselves confronted ableism, but there's also the potential for people who are with them to also confront. Now, we haven't done the research on ableism, so we don't know for sure what happens when other people confront ableism, but we do know a lot from research on sexism and racism. And what that tells us is quite positive things. What it tells us is if non-targets confront ableism or confront prejudice, in this case sexism and racism, it can be quite favourable in terms of outcomes. So for example, if you have a man confronting sexism against a woman, that can lead to very favorable outcomes. So from that, I would encourage everyone to confront prejudice and discrimination if they feel comfortable doing so.
All right, thanks for that, Cadeyrn. That's very good advice. And another question I have is, for example, people with CP are just kind of living their own lives and doing what they want to do. And I think just from my experience, I'm actually, living my own life, doing what I was wanted to do. So for me, it's essentially ordinary. And so ha- I guess the a difference of ableism as opposed to sexism or homophobia and other things is that often people don't have bad intentions. They mean well with ableism, but they don't realize they're doing it. So if you, for example, if someone says, "Oh, you've inspired me to do this," is that necessarily ableism or not?
That's a very good question. And it goes back to the intent. And sometimes we don't know the intent. But to say you're inspiring means that I've seen something that you do and that has inspired me to change something I do. For example, I might go to an art museum and they could inspire me to take up drawing or painting. So when I use inspiration in that sense, there's a behavior outcome or a change of thinking. I'm doing something differently. I think, unfortunately, when a lot of people would say you're inspirational, what their behavior and or thoughts haven't changed. For example, um, on occasion, I get called inspirational for going to the gym. But the person doing that does not change any of his thinking or their behavior. And I think in those circumstances, what they are reacting to is they are amazed to see me there. So it's not inspirational. It's not inspirational. It's more amazement. And so if you unpack that a little bit further, why are they amazed? Well, they didn't expect to see someone with cerebral palsy at the gym. So I think also it's become a kind of a reflex thing, and that sometimes we see a person with a person with disability, a person with cerebral palsy, and sometimes we blurt out something like that. Oh, you're so inspirational. Without thinking and without realizing what it is you're really saying. So, in a nutshell, yes, people with cerebral palsy can and are inspirational. but often we are labeled inspirational, and the people mean different things.
That's right, Cadeyrn. Yes, I agree on several of those points. And, I've also been in those situations where, people go, they see it as something amazing. Uh, as you said, good that they're not expecting you to be in that particular situation, like going to the gym. And my one of my common responses to that is to the person I just say, well, you really need to get out more. So, which they
That's
do.
that's a really good response, Ryder.
So we have another question. So, and this is, I would say, for the panel. So, as a parent of a teenager living with cerebral palsy, what would have helped you during those years to challenge ableism and to be more confident to speak up in adulthood?
I can go if you like.
Go
It's a
for it then.
it's a really great question, and it's also a really hard question because I think we all know that being a teenager is just really hard for most of us for a variety of reasons, and I also think that for many of us, I think bullying is also a really common experience at schools for most kids, and I think for anyone that's different for any reason, you get called out. So I think the thing that has made me a stronger person is really peer support, and so that's having a good social network at school. People that are kind of like-minded and supportive, and that kind of stick up for each other. And I think as an adult, like again, ableism's a really funny one for me. I'm Generation X, and when I was growing up, disability was not really talked about outside of clinical settings and things like that. And kind of people were quite. I mean, it still is in many ways a taboo topic, right? Like people don't want to talk about it. So ableism is actually a concept that's quite almost, I didn't used to know what I wouldn't have known the word 10 or 20 years ago, but in recent years, meeting this group of people that are on this call, getting involved in a peer support network through CPSN, that's really been life-changing for me and has helped me become, more aware about myself as a person with CP, and therefore more confident in able to speak up and confront ableism when it happens. So yeah, so peer support.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Finn. Like you, I'm in that same cool generation, and and you raised a very good point earlier about back when we were teenagers, there wasn't really a concept of ableism. And speaking from my personal experience, um, there wasn't really a discussion of disability. So I think to the point of the question, as a teenager, um, you know, because there wasn't, I mean, we've thankfully socially evolved quite a bit in the discussion and recognition of disability since then, but it's something that as a teenager I wouldn't have thought of because the the main focus I think was just trying to fit in. And I think that goes for any teenager, uh, with or without a disability. So I think over time, these attitudes change. So I think for teenagers now, and back to another one of Finn's points, peer support is incredibly important. I was lucky enough to have a really good group of friends to where any kind of bullying or anything like that, I really didn't see that much of because I had kind of that protective shield in a way that I didn't know that until later. It wasn't until my going to uni and going into kind of the real world that I experienced ableism full on. So I would say to parents out there to have your kids be proud of their disability and proud of who they are. And I think that will help radiate that confidence to others and hopefully be an aid in confronting ableism that they encounter. So we have another. Oh, does anyone else want to go?
Can we hear
Sure.
from Alice and Adam?
I totally agree with Finn and Wade. I had a really supportive group of friends at high school that really helped me. I didn't experience any bullying in high school because of these wonderful group of friends, but in primary school it was the total opposite. I did have bullying. So I was grateful that by the time I got to high school and was a teenager, that I had that support around me.
Yeah, I think in general it's
Okay. Adam said, I agree with Alice and finding that support can take some time, but very helpful when you do. So that's Adam. I'd like to throw together a couple of things that have just come out there. Like finding ways I'm getting on in years as well. And my experiences as a teenager are probably quite different to teens these days. One of the things that's important in teenage years is that it's a time where your identity develops. That is, who am I? And it would be beneficial during that time if disability is a positive part of your disability. That is, if you can say, I am proud that I've cerebral palsy, I'm a proud person with cerebral palsy, I'm a proud person with disability. If you can achieve that, that is the goal of this fashion life. And I think I like when Finn, Wade and I work with teenagers, there's a lot of resources out there that you could engage with and you could have your son to engage with. Ideas like the social model of disability, which frames disability not as an individual medical problem, but as a societal problem. Learning about disability rights and the idea that the people with disability have the same rights as everyone else. That's so important. And also the realization that people with cerebral palsy have many of the same goals in life. We're talking about big goals here. Yeah, it's people without disability. So, talking to your son early about what he's going to do when he grows up, what he's going to do when he leaves school, what vocational opportunities might be available, what he's interested in. So, it's setting and reinforcing the expectations that he he could he will have a life like everyone else. Those are the things I would focus on.
Yeah, all very good points, Cadeyrn. And I think that, one thing that's, not unique, but definitely helps shape who we are as people with CP is that it is a lifelong disability. We don't know anything different. We've had it since day one. So it is very much a part of who we are. And I think going back to your point, we should be proud of that because it is who we are. At the very base of anyone, I think they should be proud of who they are. And in our case, we had CP. And so, but that doesn't really change what we want to achieve in life and the goals that we want to pursue and who we want to be. I mean, just here, the five of us, we have a, social scientist, community worker, soon to be speech pathologist, studying, a broadcaster, a software engineer. And I'm just an old retired guy that is a board director. But also in my previous life, I was an international consultant. So, and that's what I wanted to do in life. I wanted to find something where I could see the world because I wanted to see it. So, again, just, do what you want to do. We're we have a couple more questions coming in. So, and we had someone from Africa joining us tonight. And it says, as someone with CP in Africa, I often face so ableism shaped by cultural attitudes and limited resources, not just individual comments. How do we advocate for ourselves and shift these everyday perceptions without always carrying the burden of educating others? Very good question. And I'll address that first. Just for my background, I worked in 13 countries across 4 different continents. So I definitely understand how cultural norms can help shape how you're viewed in society. And I can say that, and I won't name particular countries, but some are better than others. Um, and I would say that it's all about, it goes back, yes, you had to educate people, but also I think that out of a lot of it is due to just ignorance because they just haven't seen people with disability doing things. And so I would say that the more people go out there and they see disabled people more often, those it'll help change those attitudes. And also talk with community groups and so forth. I'm sure they'll be able to help as well. Would anyone else on the panel like to add to that?
I can maybe add to it. It's
Okay.
like, I think that kind of cultural attitudes and really deeply embedded societal attitudes about disability again, it's sort of like ableism itself. It's very sort of embedded and it can be quite ubiquitous. And I guess I just going back to the sort of strategies that our research highlighted, just thinking about the constant burden, feeling like you always have to educate someone. I mean, that's something that kind of came up in the responses. And I guess disengaging, just choosing to walk away from it, or as Wade mentioned, just getting out there and being independent and getting on with it, are also valid strategies. You don't have to be, not education isn't the only way to respond to ableism. And I think that for me personally, that was a real light bulb moment with going through this kind of process of developing this research, because at the start of our research, a number of people had said, as I mentioned in my section, that they couldn't really think of times they'd successfully confronted ableism, but it's almost actually redefining what success can be. And, even just kind of rising above a situation and being like Teflon and carrying on, that can be a form of success and coping.
Yes.
I think that's well said, Finn. I think that ableism is everywhere. It's not particular countries. Different people have different mindsets when it comes to disability and cerebral palsy. But I think it's about getting out there, taking the opportunities that we have, making the most of them, and challenging perceptions. And we do, unfortunately, have to do the heavy lifting sometimes and challenge people and educate people, because if we don't do it, then who's going to do it? And through educating people, even though it gets so tiresome, through educating people, we make the path just a little bit easier for the next person with cerebral palsy to come along. And if you look at societal attitudes to disability 10, 20, 50 years ago, they're quite different from today. So that means that people before us did the heavy lifting, and we are benefiting from that today. So I think it's incumbent on us to, in conjunction with the people that support us, to carry on that mission to make society a little bit more inclusive, to reduce prejudice, just a little bit, in ourselves and in other people, and try to make the world a slightly better place every day.
I think you raised a valid point there, Cadeyrn, that we have to continually educate. And a few years ago, I attended a presentation by R.J. Mitt, who played Walt Jr. in Breaking Bad, and he has CP. And one of the things that I really took home from that presentation, because there were quite a few teenagers in the audience and young adults. And he said, for those of you that are, still in school, still in high school, and you think somehow this all ends once you get out of high school. He said, I got news for you. It doesn't, and it never will. You will continue to need to educate and educate people, and most importantly, advocate for yourself. So, just I'm conscious of time, and we do have a couple of other entries. Let's see. So there's a comment here saying all the issues raised are so valid. As a person who lives with CP, I'm still coming to terms with the concept of ableism. And I'll just say, hey, you're not alone. This, I tell you, before I read Cadeyrn's paper, I didn't know about how much ableism encompassed. So even for me, this is very educational as well. So thanks to Cadeyrn and his team of researchers for this. And I'm just going to see if we have any others. And question here, how do you think ableism will change as we age with CP? Good one.
I might put it to Finn Adam or Alice. Have you noticed ableism changing as you've got older?
I'll say for me, what I've found interesting is that, and again, it's interesting because obviously I'm getting older as well, but I don't really sense it or experience it that much from younger generations. It's people that are older than I am. So that's interesting. I think when I was younger, it was actually the reverse.
Yeah, I think.
Go Finn.
Sorry. I was going to say, yeah, I think as other people we've been talking about, attitudes to disability in general are changing. And I thought that was a really interesting question because my mind went in two directions. Like I kind of thought of aging, and everybody gets older, and in fact aging is a form of disability because you all become more disabled as you age, right? So actually I think as you get older you can be more likely to experience ableism in older years. So I think we've all seen older people being infantilized, or yeah, all the same kind of issues can happen in older age. And then, have I noticed ableism change as I've got older? Well, as I said before, I don't think I really recognized ableism in my younger years as much as I do now. But I'm going to put a positive spin on it and say that in thinking about ableism and in hearing about how, strategies that people can use, I'm going to say, yeah, actually, I think I'll get better at dealing with it. And, I think that kind of everyday benevolent ableism that we all have, and, often things happen and I just feel like, oh, I'm not going to say something because it feels too hopeless. But maybe this that I'm kind of learning, no, I can advocate for myself in different ways, and I can do it in a way that feels good for myself, and maybe helps the person understand, as well-meaning as they were, that maybe there's a different way they could have acted.
It's fun. I think what the research tells us is that ableism is getting less over time. It's still very much there. It's going to be around for decades to come, and And unfortunately, we're not going to see the end of it in their lives. But it is decreasing. And the more people like us, or the more people with cerebral palsy are involved in society doing the things that everyone else does, then that just becomes a regular part of society. And society will adapt, and seeing someone like us won't be remarkable.
Very good point, Cadeyrn, and to look, because we're running close to time here. This is more of a comment. And this person says, I think it is a gendered component too. I have transitioned, and the way I'm treated now that I'm a middle-aged man is different to the way I was treated before transition. Cis women are much more likely to experience ageism, and it's an intersection with sexism, and then that they have CP and ableism. And I think ageism is also just complicates the picture as well, to where you're you're focusing as you grow older on the ableism bits, and then the ageism bits tend to creep in as well as you get older. But hopefully you've learned from experience as you grow older, and you're better able to deal with both. So thank you all. This has been a really good discussion tonight. And and just a comment from Adam. Get to it. And Adam says that in regards to how he deals with it as he ages, for me is a yes, no. For me is about the same or maybe little bit better. So I'm glad that it's getting a little bit better at him. So, but thank you all for such an insightful presentation tonight. I'm sure that the people with lived experience definitely can relate to all of this, and even learn something from it as well. So, and thanks to you, everyone who joined us tonight. We hope this webinar was insightful and found it helpful. And you can subscribe to the MyCP Guide newsletter or follow MyCP Guide on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn to find out when our next webinars will be and other updates as well. And thanks again for our friends at CPSN for helping us put this webinar on ableism on tonight. So thanks again. Have a good evening, and we'll see you at the next webinar.